welcome to the Sacred Femme Alchemy podcast, a podcast to help you on your sacred feminine journey towards self-love and healing. I'm your host, Lisa Mae Francisco, a sacred feminine guide and mentor. In the podcast, we'll dive deep on how to heal your core wounds, reclaim your feminine power, and liberate your truth so you can be your wild, authentic self. Thanks so much for listening. I'm super excited that you're here. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Sacred Femme Alchemy podcast. And today is a very special episode because I have a very special guest. Her name is Erica Rodas, and she is oh my goodness, she's a pelvic oncology therapist turned womb mentor and guide. That just sounds, it speaks to my soul. Her business, Rubia, bridges the gap between traditional healthcare and spiritual practice, guiding women to know their bodies as sacred, wise, and powerful, and to connect with a fierce knowing and medicine. Oh my goodness, that's so powerful. And I'm so excited that you're here, Erica. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm feeling giddiness too to connect with you and just dive into all the things.
I know, it's like a girl crush. And I was telling Erica before, in our little green room that I was updating my podcast spreadsheet. And usually I like to plan ahead and think about different guests that I want to call in. And I had heard of Erica through our mutual friend. Her name happens to be Erica. And she was also on a previous podcast episode of mine where we talked about grief, and I'll link it in the show notes. But when she had told me about Erica, I actually put her already on my podcast sheet. And I had her scheduled for January. I was like, okay, I'm going to pitch her to be on, da, 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 da. And then when I was looking at that yesterday, I just thought it was just this really beautiful moment that I happened to be interviewing you today. And when I had taken your class, Bone Deep, which was this beautiful online session with other women and really leaning into this beautiful practice of tending to our pelvic floor. And it was just magical. And so before we get into that, I would just love to dive in and know, how did you even get into this work of like pelvic care, first of all, but then diving in deeper also into holistic pelvic care and womb and just like all those juicy words that you used. So would love to have you expand on that.
Yeah, thank you. So I feel like you could probably relate to this too, that there was many more signs earlier than you consciously knew to kind of start a certain path. But I guess consciously, when I first became an occupational therapist, I was really drawn to oncology and working with breast cancer. And so was in that space for 4 or 5 years and was kind of seeing this space that women were coming in, that they had this cancer diagnosis, but at baseline didn't really have a really intact relationship with their body, or like a really intimate relationship with their body. And then you have something like cancer come along and kind of totally shakes everything up, and you come out on the other side and you're like, what now? And the relationship with their body was actually really foreign and not even something that they really knew where to begin. Around that same time, I was in a job that in the beginning was sort of like my dream job. It was this private practice in New York City and was supportive for the first few years, but I had no education at that point from school on like nervous system or how to really self-care my body beyond go to yoga, get a massage, drink green juice, sort of like all these things.
Yeah.
And so I started having pelvic pain in 2019.
Wow.
At that time, I had taken a lot of manual therapy courses for more of the whole body, had taken one on the pelvis. So I went to practitioners in New York that I thought were well-versed in those things that really did seem more holistic at the time. Things like the Burrell Institute or John Barnes myofascial release. And I wasn't seeing a lot of relief. And these people were very skilled practitioners, but even after all of the self-study I had done, because in college, even to go back just one minor step, I had chronic low back pain, which now I think was probably related to pelvis, but for 6 or 7 years in and out of different PT offices and things like that. So I sort of was thinking like, oh yeah, I know how to do this. I've done chronic pain before, and this was one that wasn't really shifting the needle at all. And there was a part of me that was still on that table wanting this person to fix me. And that was really blown away by how having something like vulva pain impacted my sense of womanhood so differently than when I'd had shoulder pain or back pain in the past. So I was like, okay, this is really different. And I was realizing how the women that I'd been working with breast cancer, I never fully appreciated how much when our breast space or our pelvis has things that are imbalanced, that it really does touch into this sense of self and woman, I believe, in a much, much deeper way. Then the pandemic came and I found this woman, Miriam Bouvet, give her a shout out. She was my holistic pelvic care therapist in Philly, and we were working virtually because of COVID. And I was kind of like, how is this woman going to help me, because she can't put her hands on me? But it was really the medicine that I needed, because I had to really come face to face with what does it feel like to put my hands on my own body, to receive my own care, to then be with all the things that come up, which is this sort of unpacking of the last 4 years. And I started to really see how I loved on your website where it said sort of this idea that you are your own ally, that truly for me, that's what my body has become. And she is such a teacher for so many things, but expanding my sense of permission, my sense of self-worth, my sense of belonging, like all of these things that seem so, we see these buzzwords everywhere, but genuinely come from like this actual flesh and are not divorced from this flesh. In fact, all of the narratives that we've learned about being woman, or all of that we have to be talking about when it comes to pelvic care. And that it's, yes, it's about some of these more biomechanical, or our posture, or how are we using our body. But it's also about what is the relationship with our body actually? What have our lived experiences actually been? How has our body been protecting us from day one in that? And once you start to feel into, oh, there's like a real vibrant relationship for me here, everything can expand from there. So
wow,
yeah,
that's so beautiful. Did you ever find the core of why you were experiencing pain in your pelvis area?
So I think for me, from a biomechanical standpoint, I'm pretty hypermobile, meaning that my fingers or like my joints are pretty loose. And so when you think about, I could get our little model if we want. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, do it. I post these on YouTube too. So
beautiful. Yeah. So this is like just the biomechanical explanation, right? That there is a certain sense of, okay, these are my bones, my pelvic bones. And then I have all of this tissue here, which people know as their pelvic floor. I like the phrase pelvic diaphragm just because it really is like our respiratory diaphragm, this real dynamic group of muscles. It's not like the static floor. But if my joints are very loose, then there's going to be at baseline even more of a, we'll call hypertonicity, meaning that my muscles are going to be working really hard all the time to stabilize. So then you come into, again, from a biomechanical, like doing back body strengthening and really making sure that the muscles around this space can support it. I think also like nervous system is huge. So I'm living in New York City at the time. I'm seeing 9 or 10 patients a day. I'm zooming off to yoga after. And it's not even like this was the stage of my life where I was like in my early 20s, like going out and partying and that kind of stuff. This was early 30s where I'm like taking good care of my body by, I'm trying to meditate, I'm trying to do yoga, I'm trying to get outside. But there was all of the doing to it. And I wasn't really having any spaces in my life to really just be, or to actually lean into. Everything was almost like, how do I manage, right? If some difficult something happens, then I just need to get calm. I need to get centered, rather than something difficult happens. How is that landed in my body? What, where am I holding that in my body? How can I engage with that? There was none of that real engagement with emotions in a way that allowed for the space for them, really.
Yeah.
I think
It's
also,
in,
yeah.
I was going to say it's interesting because you brought up also that it kind of colored or made it even more colorful when you looked back and reflected on your work with the women who had breast cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And almost as if what are the somatic effects, right? Especially
Absolutely.
around the breasts, and just seeing that with your own self by being able to be your own healer, of putting
Mm.
your hands on your body, understanding that as well. So I can only imagine how much deeper those sessions were, not only with yourself, but then how it influenced you working with different clients, and
Mm-hmm.
understanding that it was just beyond that physical
Mm-hmm.
lens.
Totally. And yeah, I think that for the past 3 years, I have been diving way more into this more
Mm-hmm.
emotional and energetic space. In the last 6 months, it's been helpful to almost bring some of the more like masculine, physical, like structural principles back so that there is kind of, yeah, like an anchor for some of these like more, not abstract, but
Mm-hmm.
wordless things.
Yeah, and that's why I loved your bone deep session so much.
Mm.
Because when I was thinking about pelvic floor, I just, okay, I'm gonna stick my fingers in there, and I'm gonna, because I have been to a pelvic floor therapist, and we were talking in the green room that I had so many UTIs, and I ended up seeing a pelvic floor therapist for that. And so, she used like the different silicone bases, and
Mm-hmm.
she would press on a point, whether it was triggered or not, I'd have to relax. And, she used all these beautiful words of imagine yourself as a rose blossoming open. It was so nice. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know that there was a pelvic floor therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was taking your session or in your session, I thought, okay, we're just going to do one of those. But
Mm-hmm.
you really spoke about it in a way that I never even heard of before, which was the pelvic bowl was the masculine
Mm.
force for us, and our energy and vitality for that feminine flow and the muscles. And my mind was blown. I was like, wow. So I'd love for you to talk about that here, because it was
Mm.
basically an external massage. We didn't do internal. And I was very shocked at how nourishing that practice was. Because, like yourself, you said, oh, I just did yoga, and, those are the things to nourish me. And it's, oh, we take baths for self care, or we get a
Mm-hmm.
massage. But have you ever actually done an external pelvic floor massage on you? It's amazing. You should join Erica's sessions. We'll put it in the show notes. I'm obsessed, but would love for you to dive into that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I loved to hear your feedback. Yeah, so the framework of a pelvic bowl is all from my study with Tammy Lynn Kent and her sense, which I've found so helpful in with client work, of when you're thinking about this as a bowl, it almost automatically brings in a sense of wholeness, and that we're not so hyper focused on the one part that is problematic. And in that, I think our nervous system. So, for instance, when I was first beginning even pelvic mapping or yoni mapping, things like that, I was coming at it from a place of, I'm in pain right now. I need to not be in pain. And so I would stick my finger in and I would just do the things, and I would, maybe not so aggressively, but it was like it was very masculine in that I was trying to
Oh,
achieve
and
it.
for listeners who don't know what yoni mapping is, can you share briefly what that
Yeah,
is?
beautiful. Yeah. I think there's so many different names for it. So I think pelvic mapping or yoni mapping in my practice of it is when you're bringing a finger inside of your vaginal canal, and you can go different depths depending on how ready your body feels. And you're
Mm-hmm.
palpating around, almost like whether you think of a clock or you think of like the four directions, north, west, south, and east. And you're sort of palpating to see, where am I feeling tension?
Mm.
Where am I feeling numbness? Where am I feeling perhaps any sort of electricity, or where is there pleasure? And you make a map. So a very simple way is to just draw a circle on a piece of paper, and then you make little notes. And over time, likely you'll start to see certain patterns. It's not a practice that I really use as much anymore, because I feel it's very good when you are a bit more diagnostic and also trying to learn your pelvic
Mm.
space.
Mm-hmm.
But I think all of the ways that I try to practice in the circles that I lead in my own is just, how can I bring more presence into this part of my body? Because from there, all the other things will come. And when I
Mm.
say presence, I mean genuinely, how can I bring, as holistic pelvic care will share, like my touch, my attention, and my breath, and really be with whatever comes up in that space. So if, for instance, a woman, even in a session where, let's say, leading through and I feel constriction in my body, I feel shortening of breath, I feel my mind is blanking out right now, that's a part of this relationship, and that's a part of the story that your body's holding. And so we don't have to actually bulldoze into that. We can breathe into that part, that sensation, and sort of see what comes. And what's beautiful about that is more and more your body becomes less something that you're fixing and more something that you're listening into. And it really is my belief that that's where change and shifts can actually happen when we start to extrapolate ourselves from this paradigm, which we've all been so accustomed to, of I get a pap smear, or maybe I haven't given birth yet, but in the birthing process or even in sex, and if this is happening, something's coming in my vagina and we're doing this, so yeah, just go in, whatever. Versus like actually pausing and being like, am I actually ready for this? Does my body feel like it can allow this, pap smear or penetration, or do I feel like I'm ready for this medical procedure? And so often that step is just barreled through because of time, because people don't know how to advocate for themselves. And so there's also this piece too, where you really get to slow down time and tune in and be like, what do I actually need in this moment? Maybe I've had sessions where women just put their hands on their heart the whole time and they're not actually doing any sort of yoni mapping. But what I would say to that is that the benefit that woman would get versus creating a yoni map just because she has this idea that she needs to, her body will trust her so much more from honoring her no and coming to a yoni mapping practice in her own pace than just being like, this is my homework, I need to, figure out where my tension points are.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. You're like, I'm so curious now with all these different questions. But I'm like, okay. But I do want to go back to, because about the masculine, the pelvic bowl,
Right.
that
Okay.
one.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing it back. So yeah, that was something that when we're thinking about different parts of our body and that are the bones in our body, and again, I want to give credit to Tammy Lynn Ken for a lot of this framework, but like our skull and our rib cage and our pelvic bowl are these real gatekeepers or reservoirs or protectors for the more feminine organs that exist inside, like our brain, like our heart and our lungs, like our bladder, uterus, our womb, and our rectum and ovaries. And so you start to see that there is such this relationship between those things where when we're feeling maybe more in like a feminine space or feeling kind of carried away or any sense of overwhelm on that side, coming to the parts of us that are really solid, and even, these bones that, yes, they are dynamic as well, but that they just can be this anchor point for us, and to actually bring our attention to those spaces when we are looking for that sense of safety, and then the things internally that can flow more easily from there. And so doing bone massage, I guess is the way to say it, was something that I kind of just stumbled into on my own, where I would be doing my own pelvic practice, and I would find that palpating my bones would feel very grounding to me, and would, if I'm like very much in my headspace and excited, or if I'm feeling overloaded from a day, that like bringing my hands to my bones just had this real like turning the dial down, almost tapping into this ancient wisdom effect. And then from that space, I could go internally if I wanted, or I could, be with my cervix or things like that. But I was finding that when I really, and even, in a session, I'll cue women to really just feel like the weight of their bones in this moment. And even as I'm saying that, right, like my voice kind of goes down. It's like this deeper, long-standing wisdom. So when I created that workshop, it was kind of to play with some of the concepts that I'd been playing with in my body in that way.
Oh, it's so beautiful. You're right. Even just touching my pubic bone, it's, it just feels so nourishing, so grounding, just such a beautiful practice. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are so many different ways. I mean, if someone wanted to get into this, where would they even start? Because I actually have had people ask me, actually, I had one client ask me, like, oh, I heard yoni mapping on a podcast and,
Mm.
I want to do that. And then that made me curious and go down the rabbit hole. And there's just so
Yeah.
much goodness. And there's, I see so many women now that are really into how do we clear the trauma out from our wombs. So there's womb trauma clearing and healing, holistic pelvic floor care and, tantra massages. And there's just so much goodness there. And so where does one even start? Would love to understand your perspective on all of these different modalities and even names that are associated with how to heal and tend to the womb.
Yeah. I love this question. So I think one of the things that I really hope to, if you take one thing from this podcast, if you're listening, is that you actually get to begin to trust yourself and your way and your pace in the ways that you're relating to your body. So when it comes to an arena where you're like, oh my gosh, there's so many modalities, where do I even start? I think first getting really clear on what is it that you're trying to not achieve, but what are you really desiring here? What are you really hoping for here? A lot of people do come to this space because they're in pain or they're trying to conceive or they're postpartum or there's a problem. And let's just name that as something that sometimes I'm like, oh, it breaks my heart that we haven't just had more neutral or at the very least, but at best, like more honoring, when we first got our bleed or just like celebration of our female bodies. So I think actually starting to pay attention to what is it that lights you up about any of these modalities, because essentially they're all different voices and lineages. I have been told that a lot of the holistic pelvic care stuff is has tantra principles in it. I haven't done as much specific study within that, but I hear that there's an overlap. I think that there is a perspective that I have been in, for better or for worse, because honestly sometimes I wonder, but that the medical system does sort of bring this diagnostic or evaluative space. And so it makes sense that if someone's in a pain space and they want more of an evaluation or that kind of diagnosis is going to be different than someone who's like, I just want to explore my sexuality, or I just want to know this part of my body better. And so actually starting to, pay attention to your body in this process and being like, as I'm looking at these different practitioners, what lights up in me? And being aware of, am I looking for one of these people to save me, or am I doing this as like another, I'm trying to be perfect, and so this is like the next thing I'm going to conquer? Because what I will tell you is that I've learned that our womb won't be conquered. It's not going to be like a frontier that we come in and we're like, yeah, it necessarily is going to be this collaborative and this relationship, right? Because the basis of, I believe, the feminine. And so I think just becoming aware of the first question, what is it that I'm hoping to explore or bring? And then if you were to bring your hand just to the front of your pelvis, like where a zipper would be, and just place it there and breathe there for 5 minutes every day, what would that bring up in you? Would that bring up like, oh my gosh, I feel like I need to do more? Would that bring up a sense of queasiness and I can't really put my hand there, this feels wrong? Would that feel actually really comfortable and, oh, I want to explore more? And start to just be aware of, if you were to look at yourself in the mirror, what would that bring up? Like, how are you actually relating to this part of your body right now?
Oh, I love that. And it's so interesting, right? In society where even young kids are just so curious and they place their hands on their private parts, and parents often stop that, like immediately it just becomes this like shameful, like
Yes.
dirty thing almost. So I love that you said, ask yourself when you put your hands on there, what do you feel?
Totally. And I
Mhm.
mean, I would say the first year of doing regular practice, there would be days where I come from a Catholic background.
Mm,
My dad, um, yeah, has different. We've come a long way with our relationship as it comes to my work, but I think there were a lot of edges that me being as exploratory in my body brought up for him as a father, sort of talking so openly, a Latin father, and all those things. But I would be, let's say, doing a massage practice, and I'd be like, I feel like I'm doing something wrong. Like, I feel like if someone were to walk in right
mm,
now, this would be like I'd get in trouble or something, or that even not being productive and just like taking the hour to just be with my body in this way. And so, even just observing that, right? And not thinking, oh gosh, I really am broken, but being like, okay, so that's a part of this conversation. And I think in the role when I do act more clinically, if we're not including that in the conversation, we're missing like a massive opportunity for healing and for potential.
mhm,
That this is not like our elbow, right? There's so much story, and even in our lineage, the way that women have been shamed and persecuted in some, like all of it for this space. And
mhm,
so likely that's going to come up a little bit in whatever your flavor is, but
mhm,
that gets to be there. And
mhm,
when it comes to like womb healing, or, I don't love sometimes the words like clearing trauma and things like that. I think it's really just about witnessing and bringing into light from the shadows, like what some of these stories that we have held there. And when we witness and when we hold that in reverence and we meet that with our breath and our devotion, meaning that we show up for ourselves again and again,
mhm,
that's to me how like healing happens, is more in the witness and the love really than I'm going to go in there and clear, which I've been there. I certainly I've certainly descended down and been like, all right, I'm clearing everything.
Let's just smudge our yoni,
Yes, exactly.
Different kind of yoni steam. Can you imagine like sage instead of, well, that's the herb. This person, this partner.
Exactly.
Oh,
Exactly.
and so it's interesting because I actually just went to a yoni workshop where we
Mm,
used yoni eggs. I mean, we didn't do like an
mm,
internal practice together, but we learned about how to use it, what to do. And we got a handbook afterwards, and it was really beautiful. And so
mm,
is what are your thoughts about that? Practice with your clients like different jade egg practices,
mm.
or because I know how popular that has been.
Yeah,
So would love to hear what you think about it.
yeah. So I'm not a huge jade egg fan, but again, I go back to what I said earlier, that if that's what someone
Mm,
really works for them, in the same ways that some therapists will use dilators for a dilator is essentially like a silicone, I don't want to say stick, but tool that you would put into your vaginal canal, and often it's used to stretch things out. And I think that a lot of us do have a resting state of hypertonicity, which I don't even love that word, but that we're
mm,
more, for instance, if I'm in like a fight or flight or even collapse, my pelvic diaphragm or my pelvic floor, instead of being down, is going to be pulled up. And so for
oh,
me, putting something
uh-huh.
like a jade egg in does create a little bit more activation, which
Uh-huh.
again can be helpful for some, but I think that the use of our own hands can't really be overstated. Now, again, you want to meet yourself where you are. So if your hands don't feel accessible, then using different tools, I think, does have value. And I'm sure that there are jade egg practitioners that could stand and say why it's their tool of choice. But I
Mm,
guess for me, nothing will ever be better than our hands, full stop, And
mm,
so, yeah, I think that's where
mhm.
I fall with that.
And it's so interesting because like someone who had recurrent UTIs,
Hmm.
it was very much how do we relax you? And I
Yeah.
didn't realize how many physical exercises, like I would do Pilates a lot, and it's
Mm.
always pull up your pelvic floor, pull up your
Exactly.
pelvic floor. And then I'm
Exactly.
like, and I didn't realize until I'm actually conscious of like, why is my pelvic floor always pulled up? And then I've, and the last year I've gotten into Kundalini so much, and you're always
Mm.
pulling, they call it Mula Bandha, your rectum, your sex organs to bring the energy up through the spine. And you're just like constantly in that tension state. And I have to catch myself like, oh, like
Mhm.
just relax.
Yeah. I love that you brought up that point because I do think our generation is way more into like Pilates and yoga, and even with something as, again, all of these things are beautiful practices. But I do think that if we're not, it's like this classic example that if I were to keep my bicep in all day, I want to be able to access the full range. And if we're constantly being pulling up and then layering it on top of, as women, many of us have felt we need to suck in our bellies or just kind of be in, or even if we're just very much in our heads because our life is asking us to be in our heads and planning and all these things, and we're just breathing into our chest and don't actually breathe into our roots. So the question is more, can I access, like we were saying before with different archetypes, my whole range, right? There's nothing wrong with pulling up for Pilates or Kundalini, but it's more just that, can I then come down from that? And I would even say that it's not as much about relaxing, though that's true, but if you're not feeling relaxed, there's a reason, right? There's something your body is holding or in sort of protection around that is just asking to be witnessed or is acting to be, accommodated maybe by creating firmer boundaries or asking for a need to be met. But I remember my first doctor I saw for my pelvic pain told me to just relax and drink more wine. And I was like, and masturbate more. I forgot that. And I was just
Oh,
like,
uh-huh.
I don't feel seen. Like, I feel like that's not what I needed from you, you know? And
Oh my gosh.
I hear what you're saying, but if I'm feeling that way, again, it's like having your own back, trusting yourself. There's something that is either not right in my external world that my body is kind of
Mm.
holding and not able to relax into, a lack of safety that I feel, or something within myself. But you know what I'm saying?
Wow, that's why.
And it was a woman, and I was like, I left being, is that the answer? Like,
I was about to ask you, did you have a male like
no,
doctor?
it was a woman. Yeah, it was a nurse practitioner, and I was just like, wow, I don't know if that's it.
Oh my gosh, no, it can be very frustrating. Like going back
Mhm.
to your very first point of there are deeper layers here when it comes to our yoni, to our breasts. And I
Mhm.
remember nobody could understand why I was getting recurrent UTIs. I mean, they gave me the
Mhm.
same lecture, are you washing, all that stuff. And I'm like,
Mhm.
yes, I'm doing everything, but I don't understand what's going on. And I had to take so many, like, I've had so many invasive doctor's appointments. And literally it was, oh, just take these pills and that should help. And I just thought, no, there has to be something more. And I even
Mhm.
asked my pelvic floor therapist, I said, is there some sort of, trauma related massage that I could
Mhm.
do? Because it was just really focused on, like you said, just putting the dilators in.
Mhm.
And how do I feel doing my stretches
Mhm.
and just being, quote unquote relaxed and ready to
Mhm.
receive. And it was a very frustrating experience. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think even um, you know, it's interesting when we think about emotions and the ones that women have been given permission to feel, really. And I feel
Mm-hmm.
like anxiety and sadness are ones that are like, okay, you guys can feel those. But rage and anger, for instance, or like a real fear beyond um, anxiety, but like a boundary has been violated, and let me take
Mm.
out my sword here. And to just pacify ourselves with, well, I just need to relax or I just need to calm. It's, is there something that actually wants to be expressed? And I love one of my teachers has really brought to that, like letting our voice come into the equation. And even from a physiological standpoint, the muscles around our jaw and the muscles around our pelvis were some of the first, are very linked in utero around the time that they're developing. And
Oh,
so
wow.
a lot of times if people are having TMJ or any kind of jaw tension, they'll find that same tension pattern in their pelvis. And so a lot of times it's, what are you not saying? What are you swallowing? Where are the ways that you can express? Coming to know our menstruation as a vehicle also for shedding and really moving things out, and that letting that be its own spiritual practice, as well as readying the things that we want to welcome in. And then as it relates to what you were speaking to, the energetic pieces, within holistic pelvic care, it's believed that the front of our pelvis, so things are around our bladder or clitoris even, are really related to this sense of angst, fear, urgency, whereas things in our back of our pelvis, such as our rectum or things like constipation or hemorrhoids, are often from like, how much support do we have in our life? And so I always present this with clients as, take this or leave this. If it stirs something in you, then let's follow that. If you're like, this actually doesn't bring any feelings of recognition, great. But that it was interesting. I recently got engaged and I had,
Congrats.
oh, thanks, love. Funny story about that with Erica, that we were supposed to have a call and then it happened that morning at 7 a.m. and I wrote her a message like, I'm not going to make our call. And she was like, what? You got engaged? But I got UTI-like symptoms 2 or 3 days after. And it was fascinating because I had this like massive happy thing, this like really joyful thing.
Wow.
And then these symptoms came up right after, and I was like, what is this about? And is there almost like this fear here around like really letting go into this joy, or really even just like all of the activity that was happening around it? And I got tested for a UTI. It was negative. So I always am curious. People, getting tested is always helpful, but a lot of times it's negative, and it is more of this like soft tissue that's happening, constriction around it, and where can we create more space for things to flow. So one more little teaching moment, like if we think of this whole space as a bowl, and ideally we want a flow through it, like a river flowing through, and that if there's any sort of restriction in any point, then it's almost, a tree that's fallen in the river, or something that kind of the leaves start to percolate and gets kind of mucky. But if we bring our touch, our attention, and our breath to that space, then it's almost like we're lifting the tree or we're clearing the leaves, and then things start to move through again. So I think where I'm at now, when symptoms like that come up, it's actually almost this opportunity to sort of pause and be like, okay, so what is happening in my life, and how is my body maybe communicating without making it such a problem,
Yeah. Wow. I feel like that was just such a metaphor for life, right?
Yeah.
Like how are you surrender and flow, and like,
Yeah,
where's the restriction coming, the tension coming, and how can you just bring more
totally.
awareness to it? And so
Yeah.
juicy. And you mentioned just, really leaning into your menstrual cycle, your moon. And I get this question a lot too with some clients of, what are some practices that you personally do when you are preparing for your moon, during your moon, that you'd like to share?
Yeah. So sort of like we're talking about this masculine feminine interplay, I really love, and similarly to like if we think of the seasons and our premenstrual time being like our luteal time being like that fall of like, how can I really prepare to make my bleed as nourishing and supported as possible? So that can look like in my luteal phase, then starting to kind of wind down my calendar, like things that like I really need to do. Obviously with some work, depending on people's work conditions or environments, like there may be some things that you can't negotiate at this point, but what are the things that I can sort of alleviate myself from having to do? And where can I really, make my plate as least full as I can? Making warming foods to have ideally like in the freezer or in the fridge. We think like root vegetables, soups, meats, so that again, like when I then slip into my bleed time, these things are already there. And then, my partner is super aware of when my cycle begins, so that there's kind of like a, hey, I may want you to be making a meal one of these next couple nights, or just kind of taking things over with our puppy, or just kind of knowing that I'm going to be a little bit of, not out of commission, but a little bit in my own.
Yeah.
Once all of that is in place, and I think it's worth saying that so many things when I first started practicing with my bleed spiritually, I was like, I'm going to master this. I'm going to make this the best. I'm going to just do these things. And I was almost like stealing against it, right? I'm going to lie down with blood on my face. I'm going to do these different things. And now I feel like my relationship with it is much softer in that, again, it's a relationship that I've been cultivating now for 4 years. And so it's almost like its own energy that when I can feel when she's coming, and I can feel when the first drops happen. And I try to, within the first 2 days, just like pretty much stay as horizontally as I can or go on some gentle walks. But like the first, either day 1 or day 2, be pretty restful. I've been trying just recently to get more in touch with the actual moon and developing that relationship and speaking with her. There's been times where I've been really into the face masks or with my blood or anointing my heart and my womb with them. There's been times where I don't use a cup anymore just because I am a bit more hypermobile. My cervix is like a little bit lax, and so to have a cup up against it sometimes isn't always the best to be pulling on it every month. So I just either use the Hannah pads, the organic pads, or just like free bleed on the days that I can be home. I'm trying to think if there's any other like real practices. Yeah, I think it's funny. It's such a softer practice than it, because it used to be also that I'd be like, I'm gonna write down all the things that I'm getting rid of, and
Oh, is she gonna tell us that she does that, like journaling prompts?
but like if that calls to you, for sure. But I think as you, like with anything, you just get to soften around all of it, and it's not about, when I use the word surrender, it takes a lot of active aspects to actually surrender, right? Because you can't surrender into nothing. So like the activeness of, I'm going to have my meals prepared, or I'm going to set these boundaries of time with my loved ones. That's pretty hard for people sometimes to ask for support or time, or to make the accommodations to be able to check out. But then once you're in that space, let it be kind of juicy and fun. And it doesn't honestly need to be so serious. You can't get it wrong. So if you do it wrong, then you have next month to practice again.
Yeah, it's so
Yeah.
interesting because everyone has these rituals around how they connect to their womb, how can they connect to their moon time. And I know for me, I like saw a bunch of women doing their moon mass, and I thought, oh, I'll try that. Like I've never done that before. I'll try that. I do that. I love it. And the reason why my skin just glows afterwards, I don't know what it is. I'm like, wow, so
Yeah.
special. But I used to use the cup. I don't use
Mm-hmm.
the cup anymore just because I ended up getting a UTI when I used the cup. And
Mm-hmm.
so now I just use period panties. And
Mm-hmm.
there's just something about, but it was funny though, because I just finished my moon a couple of days ago. And I had
Mm.
that thought of, oh my gosh, I didn't do the thing where I write down like how my last month was
I
and
know.
what I'm going to release. And it's like applying that softness, at least that you will be fine. It's okay if you didn't do it this one time. You're not a bad, woman for not
Yeah.
connecting to your period in the ritualistic way that other women suggest, or,
Mm-hmm.
project that as the right way to do it. And if you're not connected to your womb, like through this ritual, then you're not feminine almost.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to like give that caveat to our audience. If you don't have a practice, that's absolutely okay. It doesn't make you any less feminine. If you have no idea what we're talking about, that is totally fine too. Everyone has their own journey with it. And it's funny because as you were speaking, and you're like, oh, I've, had this practice for 4 years. And I think it's so easy for people to get in their mind and think, oh, I need to learn these practices. And like you say, conquer it. I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
write down my to-do list of what I need to do to be more feminine or,
Yeah. Yes. But then it just
yeah.
becomes like another thing that we're trying to like conquer or be perfect at, or whatever the thing. I love that you're speaking to this nuance in all of this, because I do think that it is so beautiful to me, for instance, that we can even have this conversation, because a lot of when I'm at the clinic, the women who are in their 70s talking about these things, it's like you wouldn't do. So let's like give us all props that we are like
Wow.
talking about the nuance of this. And have we swung so far that now it's like it has to look a certain way and is kind of dogmatic, which is really what we're trying to move away from.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I had this really interesting story a couple of weeks ago where I was teaching at my grad school program, and the professor had told me that some of the students were very leery of holistic pelvic care and some of the concepts.
Oh, wow.
Which, going into that, sort of knowing that people are maybe feeling a little bit antagonistic, is a little bit like, oh, are people, judging me? Are they not liking me? But then sort of
Yeah.
coming into what's actually true here. And what actually got to be true, and which is what I said to them in the beginning, was that if the principles that I'm talking about, I'm speaking to these principles because, I've been an OT for 9 years. I use them in my own body. I use them with women who are having real life medical conditions, like all the things that and if I say these things to you and you don't resonate with them, because the lecture was on self-care as a practitioner, I was
Oh,
like, then your
wow.
first act as self-care gets to be that you say, no, this actually doesn't work for me, and I don't feel like participating in this today. So that you actually get to decide that, and that gets to be okay. So in all of these things, I'd say the same with your bleed, that part of what we're trying to achieve, if anything, is for you to reclaim your own sense of agency and your own relationship with your body. And so if doing like a, practice with your blood or whatever it is a no right now, that gets to be true, right? We don't have to like conform ourselves into all the things. So it is interesting when I sort of presented that to them, because I guess they were more of like the medical model, didn't sort of believe in this mind body thing.
Oh,
And
wow.
from my perspective, it seemed like there was like this fight that then was like, oh, so you're not going to try to conform me into your, wait, really? And there was just a softening in the group that was like, yeah, like you're not agreeing with me gets to be here. No problem. And what does that do when we can meet our bodies that way too, and our own reactions?
It's kind of, it just relates so beautifully back to this idea of conquering, right? It's you didn't come in there to conquer their own mindset and belief system and perception and trying to get them to understand and adopt your way of thinking. But it was
Yeah,
like, you know, let's listen to that story. What is the
totally.
resistance coming up? And just creating space and room for that to be there and to honor that. Like what you said with one of your clients of just maybe you just want to place your hands on your heart and that's it. Like
Mm-hmm.
checking in with yourself. So that's just so beautiful.
Mm. Yeah, it was a moment where I was like, oh, this is like an opportunity to practice this. Okay, let's do this.
Mm.
Yeah.
And it's almost giving people this idea that we're meeting you where you are,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's so interesting because, in this like sacred feminine work and space, a lot of it has gotten to be very, spiritual. And I do teach
Mm-hmm.
on, the feminine spirituality and all of that and the goddess, but I also understand for the women who want to tap into this, but aren't necessarily have a strong spiritual practice, or maybe they have religious trauma or, whatever their concept of God, goddess, or spirit or source is. I do recommend psychology books that
Mm.
are about how to tap into that feminine spirit and how to have that sort of masculine processing of the actual myths that speaks that psycho spiritual language. So it's no, I'm not like brainwashing you, but it's almost like that principle of how do we bring in both like the feminine way of receiving interiorization, intuiting, seeing what
Mm.
comes up for us, seeing our relation to these concepts, but then also being able to process it in a very, action oriented, like logical way so that both perspectives can land there. So,
Mm-hmm.
mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I feel like when you were speaking, I loved what I loved in what you just shared is that you did offer them an avenue to meet them where they are, but you also didn't like water down or shape shift like what you have to offer. And I think that's so powerful too. And when I even first came onto your page, I was like, oh my gosh, there's like a woman here who really like knows what she's here to say. And I
Mhm.
think that even if people aren't able to meet you in that I believe does stir something where
Mhm.
you don't even have they don't even have to believe what you believe, but just to be like, oh wow, she's in her own voice. Let me
Mhm.
find mine, which might look totally different.
Mhm.
But yeah.
Absolutely. And I would love for you to speak about this too, and you mentioned it just a little bit of how in utero, the jaw and the yoni are often, connected. And I've often seen many graphics about that, right? Where women, it's if something is coming up with your throat and your yoni, they're connected. And so would love for you to share about that and just finding your
Yeah.
voice.
Yeah, that's been a big medicine for me, I think, is really owning my own voice and even discerning when something is coming like from my womb, or if people are uncomfortable with that word, even like from my center, and when it kind of lands and says, this is what's true for me. It's funny. And when I'm just reacting to something, or when I'm trying to, placate someone, or sort of any of the people pleasing flavors, I think that for me, aside from as we're saying, like the connections physiologically between our jaw and our pelvis, that it really comes back to this idea of truth. And the more that you are with your body, the only way I can describe it is the more that you can really discern like what a yes feels like in your body. You can discern what a no feels like in your body. And it becomes harder to ignore those things because like self-abandonment just becomes less and less of an option. And I don't know how to do this any other way now, because I can't, when you do put your hands on your body or any of these practices, it's like you become so well versed in your body's language that it's really hard to sort of fake things, or at the very least you're aware when you're speaking from a place that's not that. And what you had said about being your own ally, that starts to take such a place in your life, that advocating for yourself, speaking your truth, it's like, again, I don't know how not to do this anymore, because I'm not reliant on the other to validate me or to provide me that safety in the same way.
And so for people that, so I love that you said, the womb doesn't resonate. Some people don't know where it is. I didn't know. I'm like, where am I supposed to put it? I mean, I honestly don't remember education, and I went to a Catholic school, and I never saw a birthing video until, I decided to go on YouTube and look up birthing. And then I realized, oh my God, that's what women go through. And I shut my laptop down. Like, no, thank you. But for people who don't know, like where is the womb? What is the womb? Some people say it's energetic. I know in yoga, they talk about the womb chakra, which is the sacral chakra, or even putting your hands on your womb. So what does that look like if someone wants to connect, if they've never had that relationship before? What can they do?
Yeah. So I was just looking, I think I lost my rectum somewhere in here, which is so funny. Just to visually, right? So when I'm using the word womb, I am referring to more of this energetic imprint that even if you've had a hysterectomy or any sort of physical, like an ovary removed or anything like that, you will always have the energetic imprint of womb, just because you came through a womb when you were birthed, and it's just an imprint of being a woman. The uterus is the physical organ, right? And so here's the rectum. This is
Oh, I
funny.
love this.
Puppy the other day had the uterus in her mouth and was like, this is so funny that you're going into this. But anyway, so we have our bladder, our vaginal canal, which connects to our cervix, and then to our uterus. And then we have our fallopian tubes into our ovaries. Behind that whole thing, we have our rectum. And all of these three organs sit within the bowl of our pelvis. Ideally, there's space between all of them, which is filled by connective tissue or fascia. A lot of times, we're going to see uterine misalignment, meaning that the uterus has either fallen back or fall forward, which causes different problems that you may feel when it comes to urinary frequency or urgency or constipation or prolapse, these different things. But if you were to take a mirror and bring it between your legs, you'd be looking at your vulva. And if you were to bring your hand to sort of the front of that vestibule or your finger, right inside would be the start of your vaginal canal that would then lead up to your cervix and your uterus. Our cervix also changes position based on where we are in our cycle. So when we're bleeding, it's going to come really low. And when we're ovulating, it's going to be really high in order to allow for penetration. And so first is just like starting to realize that your uterus would be in the center of your bowl, ideally, or your womb. And so even if you were just to put a hand over your pelvis, I always give this just as the first start where a zipper would be, and breathe into that space and bring your attention as if you were descending it down into the center of your bowl. What does that feel like to you? Does that feel like there's an absence there? Does that feel like darkness or a cave? Does it feel like, oh, there's actually, it feels like there's trees here, or like a lusciousness? It feels like it's really hot, it's really cold, like getting actually very specific with sensation. And then you can decide, how do I want to engage with this? And that could be, again, as simple as just a hand there. That could be every day for one cycle, you'll place your finger inside and feel your cervix in its different heights, which a lot of us have a very high cervix, because if we're not feeling safe, then it's almost like it's not going to descend. Or you could start with some of the massage that we've been talking about. So there's so many different ways to start to get to know the physical space. And then in terms of the womb, it's like your relationship is going to be so distinct, So I think that when, again, we have these sort of masculine structures, okay, I'm going to do this thing, then you like allow the magic of your specific blueprint, fingerprint, elixir of feminine to emerge in that.
Oh, so beautiful. Thank you. I'm like, wow, I'm going to do that afterwards.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because I often think about when I do, even this is like an educational session, I just wish our reproductive education was so thorough, so women weren't confused about their bodies, so they know, what are the organs, what they can do, what even happens during their moon time, what foods to eat. It's just,
I know.
It's such a huge gap. And I would love, if I have a daughter one day, to be able to send her to school. What you learned today, and even women who go through menopause, right? Yeah.
And the way that you're talking about it too, it's like, if we could learn about it in this way of like wonder, because as you're talking, like your eyes are kind of lighting up and there's like this, oh my gosh, right? Versus like how to not get pregnant, or how to avoid breast cancer, or how to, like, I feel like so much of the education that is available at best is it's kind of like fear mongering how to avoid something. And so that's also, if you take another thing from this podcast, is if you're feeling like there's a gap or a dissonance between you and your body, please give yourself some grace, because 9 out of 10 messages that we've received have not been one of reverence of honor. They've been one of like fear and control. And so you're not crazy or alone, or like, why do I feel this way? It's because we've all been getting these messages,
And I love that you even opened up the podcast episode with that, of just women feeling not connected to their bodies. And whether it's being SA'd or experiencing something or taking birth control and not even understanding, like I was on birth control for, oh my gosh, decades. And I remember the first time I ended up getting my period, like as an actual adult, because I got on birth control when I was 16, 17, got off it when I was 31. And then I didn't have a period for a full year because I was on the medication where you didn't have a period. And so signals weren't being sent to my brain to have it. And so I went to acupuncture, and then we got it in a month. It was great. But there was this thing of, oh, so this is what it feels. This is all the seasons that I'm experiencing. And I just hadn't ever felt those sensations before of, oh my gosh, my breasts are really tender, or, oh, like, I need to stay home because I'm on my period and I just don't want to be around people. I physically can't do anything. And so it's just, you get this new language in a way. And it's just so fun to dive into it and just all the magic that's there. But it's true where, it's so easy to feel disconnected from your body and shame yourself of, how do I not know my body? But maybe it's because you had an experience where your body wasn't even yours to begin with.
Beautiful. And we're like, being a woman or having your period was like presented as this big burden, And it's
Yeah.
like what you just said about magical. It's like there's actually, not only is it that we could get to a place where we don't have tender breasts and we don't have cramps and like sort of the absence of challenging symptoms, that's on the table here. But what's also on the table is like this magic and this like, um, again, when you talk about different archetypes and sort of a sense of ourself as this like full range woman and like I'm in my power and I can be living in my life, that's on the table too. So it's, whew, there's a lot.
So much.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. But it's just been so wonderful having you on here. I feel like I'm gonna do part 2 with you. like there's other questions. I think we didn't even get into fertility or I'm very curious. Have you read the book Womb Awakening before?
I think I have it on my shelf, but I haven't read it all the way through.
That book was dense.
Very dense, but beautiful. But there's a lot there. So I think I've my bookshelf's in my closet, but I'm pretty sure it's like a couple who wrote it.
Yes. And someone had recommended to me. I was actually, oh my God, this was a really funny story. I was, like I was thinking to myself, I was like, oh, I just want to find a goddess group. And then I went to go get chai. I visited my sister in the city in the Bay Area. And all of a sudden I see a sign that says Goddess Gathering. I started thinking, I was like, okay, I've been here many times. Yeah, I was like, I've been here many times. I have never seen this sign. I walk in and it was this beautiful goddess den and this woman, she does events there. I mean, unfortunately it closed down, but she was reading this book called Womb Awakening. And she was talking about it. And then all of a sudden I took this divine feminine class and learning about how to use energetics and all of that and elements. And she had also mentioned it to me. So I was like, okay, well, I need to read this. And I got it. And it was filled with such potent information. And unlike you, I had not finished it because it is a true textbook. I mean, it's historical, so much of it's beautiful information because, for people who are like, oh, okay, this might be a little energetics or too spiritual. Like they really did their research and it was totally like historically backed of how the womb was revered and how many different cultures and different periods in time that there was this wisdom there.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been finding in the last few years, and I think I'm kind of coming out of it a little bit, but it's like there's a period of my life, and if you are kind of just getting into this work, where my brain needed to be satiated to a certain point before I felt safe enough to go into my body. So I really needed to read the books about my cycle and how to, what foods to eat and what was like some of the anatomy and what was like some of the masculine principles of I need to know these things. And then I think there's a period where you feel that, or where maybe there is an opportunity to descend down into, can I actually be with my body and let her be the teacher for a little while? And it was interesting because a woman yesterday at the clinic asked me, what are some of my favorite books or podcasts and things like that? And I gave her some. But what I really wanted to say, but I didn't know if she was available for it, was like, that will get you to a point, and then it's about coming in,
Oh
But
my
yeah,
gosh.
Womb Awakening has so much. So there's like a great place to send people to.
Amazing. And what recommendations did you give that woman? We can share it too.
Yeah. So I'm biased with Tammy Lynn Kent. Like I feel Wild Feminine and Wild Creative and Mothering from Your Center are really good ways to get well versed in this kind of holistic pelvic care mind framework. I also really love for cycle care, Wild Power and what's the one about menopause? I haven't read it, but I really loved Wild Power. Wild something else. The Red School is a great place to send people for menstrual cycle stuff. Come As You Are is great for getting to know your anatomy and sexuality at a really introductory level. Those are the ones that are like in my mind mentally. I have a written list, but I feel like those are the ones that when I think about that have really touched me would be a place to start. Yeah, I can send recommendation via email or something too if you want to put other resources.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much. And how can people work with you? What current offerings do you have? How do they get in touch?
Yeah, so I'm doing a monthly hands-on practice for the next 3 months called Begin Again. Our first circle is next Monday. You can drop in for one or all three. We'll be working through belly massage, vulva, and then our last one will be more internal, but kind of making our way down in so many of the concepts that we talked about today. And then I actually shifted my offerings from sort of the extended mentorship to just single sessions. And the two that I have right now are both called Root Work and Resting Place. So Root Work is more coming into your body, understanding a lot of the concepts that we talked about today. Resting Place is really meant for women who have had either a medical event or a birth experience or something that they never had the space to really be with and feel into, and kind of doing ceremony to lay that to rest and to feel into, what's underneath that space and really honoring what has been. So those are the two ways. And then if you're local to, I'm on Cape Cod, so I do in-person work as well. But that's kind of a little bit growing because I just got here, so I'm still figuring out where that's going to be.
Oh, amazing. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's been so lovely to connect and hear about the magic you share and the offerings that you have and how you're helping the world and just women come into their own.
Thank you so much. I loved this conversation so much.
Amazing. Thank you. And thank you to the listeners. I will definitely share everything that Erica said in terms of how to get in touch with her, including the resources. And I will catch you all on the next episode. Bye, everyone.